Welcome to our panel, Debunking Cloud Myths for a Better Tomorrow. I'm Kate Smage, I'm a senior partner in McKinsey's London office, and I'm the global leader of McKinsey Digital. I want to start by acknowledging that we're living through one of the most profound changes in recent history. In reaction to the pandemic, hundreds of millions of people around the world had to move to digital. And it happened and is still happening very quickly. In fact, during this great digital migration, we saw 5 years in the adoption of digital in just 8 weeks. Cloud, in particular, has been noted as one of the technologies that made all of this possible. And it's just going to be more important. In fact, our recent research estimates that by 2030, the cloud opportunity for Fortune 500 companies will be $1 trillion in run rate EBITDA. So it's now undeniable that cloud is essential to the development of the digital economy, and we as a tech community need to understand it better. Despite progress, there have been big issues with cloud adoption, and much less value than we'd all hoped for. From 10 years of experience with cloud now, we know that the value equation is more complex and more nuanced than many of us believed. Only when armed with a holistic and a deep understanding of cloud will our next generation of tech leaders be able to capture cloud's full value. So, in today's panel, we've invited 3 fantastic technologists who are going to share with us their experiences in leading their organizations into the cloud. And they're going to help us to debunk some of these cloud myths. Just how big is the value of cloud? What is it that makes for a successful cloud transformation? And what do we need to be wary of along that journey? So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists for today. First of all, we have Jerry Martin Flickinger. Jerry is the Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Starbucks. Under Jerry's leadership, Starbucks Technology has deployed various industry-leading cloud-based and digital solutions, such as mobile order and pay, voice ordering, and social gifting. Next, we have Don Dewitt. Don is currently CEO and founder of Concourse Labs. This is a company that accelerates digital transformation through automated cloud governance. Don also led the global technology division at Goldman Sachs for a number of years, and we're excited to hear more about that. And finally, we have Andrea Norris, Director at the Center for Information Technology and the CIO of the US National Institutes of Health. Andrea is responsible for the NIH's $1 billion IT portfolio in supporting scientific research and discovery. So welcome, Jerry, welcome, Don, welcome, Andrea. It is an absolute pleasure to have you all here today with us. And like I said earlier, cloud is big. Between 2015 and 2020, the revenue of the 3 big public cloud providers quintupled. More than 90% of enterprises have reported using cloud technology in some way, shape, or form. So, Jerry, why don't you start by telling us how big is cloud for you at Starbucks?
Well, we've adopted cloud in a very big way, and it's always important to start with the business value that drives cloud usage. For us, if you think about Starbucks, and you think, especially pre-pandemic, everyone would come to Starbucks on their way to work in the morning, which meant that we had very spiky traffic. We did as much as 20 times the volume in a 15-minute period every weekday. And you can imagine in a classic data center model, if you tried to actually buy enough iron to do that, you would be buying iron that just sits idle the vast majority of the time. So for us, because of the spiky nature, we found it was an excellent way to start gathering all of our transaction data. So for us, number 1 was scalability, spiky traffic. Number 2 was resiliency, which really led us to go further with active-active. And then, of course, 3 is how fast you can spin up instances when you need them for dev or proof of concepts. So for us, it's very prevalent. It is a big part of our backbone now, and pretty much everything that is transaction-based runs through some form of a cloud technology.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Jerry. And Andrea, you're obviously dealing with huge amounts of data in your sector. How important is cloud for you and for your organization?
NIH, National Institutes of Health, where I am from, It has literally changed the way we are conducting research. Each year, we support over 300,000 researchers at about 2,500 academic institutions around the country, and including medical centers located all around the United States and the world. And we focus on everything from basic science to conducting clinical trials to translating that research to creating new treatments and cures. And the advances in technology that we've seen through technology-enabled research are nothing short of amazing. Today, we're generating vast amounts of data, so much more than what we could ever do. It's doubling, in fact, every single year. In fact, the cost of sequencing a human genome has plunged to less than $1,000. That's at least 3 million times less expensive than it was when we completed the human genome just 15, 20 short years ago. So this has led to a whole set of big data research programs, things like the All of Us program, where we're collecting data from 1 million participants to be able to do more precise medical treatments based on your history, your environment, your medical characteristics. The Brain Initiative, where we're trying to map the brain just as we did the human genome. The cancer genomic data sets and data sets spanning all kinds of different types of data. These data resources were so big you couldn't really compute on them. You couldn't download them and compute on them in local environments at our research centers and universities around the country and on our campus. And so cloud became a necessity. It has really helped change the way we do science. It's been amazing to watch over these last few years.
That's incredible. I think what I hear from you is that while we've seen huge swathes of progress as a result of cloud, really we're only just scratching at the surface of this. So Don, you work across multiple sectors at Concourse Labs. How have you seen cloud shake out across these different sectors?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think as we heard from these two stories, that the value of cloud to business is fundamental, and it's really helping change the way businesses are operating, and we see that really across all industries. Having said that, we think that a lot of the migration and a lot of the real use of cloud in business is still in front of us. If we look back at the last 10 years, we've seen great examples of companies that started from scratch as cloud native and have become some of the most household names that we think about today in terms of major companies, but many companies and industries that have been more historically investors in technology, perhaps more regulated, financial services, healthcare, pharmaceutical. They've had a different challenge of how to begin to really adopt into the cloud, to really drive their own strategies, to begin to get advantage. But we think we're still in the early stages of that migration. There's many more to come. We also believe that the cloud is organic. It's going to change. So what we think today is kind of the services that we will see from most of the major cloud providers will continue to expand. And we think as institutions and enterprises begin to adopt cloud more rapidly, we'll see new ways that the cloud providers will provide services that are tailored perhaps more towards large corporate enterprise than they have historically.
Thank you, Don. Now, each of you have led successful cloud transformations in very different institutions. So I'm curious to know whether or not the factors that define success are actually quite similar. So let's start with Andrea perhaps first this time.
So a couple of years ago, we established a new national program called the STRIDES program, which was to join with industry to go down an experiential journey to see if we could help move our researchers to these large data sets for these big data programs where it was no longer practical for them to download data and do their computations and do their scientific study. We wanted to be able to have them go to the cloud, bring their tools, bring their analytics, work in collaboration with researchers that they may not even know, work together, deliver result and accelerate the discoveries, leave that behind for the next researchers that would come, and to do that in as fast and agile way as possible. And so we've partnered with commercial cloud platform providers to support not only our researchers at the NIH, but also those 300,000 researchers and support individuals who we fund each and every year. And so it is making such a difference in how we do science with bringing the agility and speed for treatments and cures we're watching each and every day. Since in just the last 18 to 24 months, we've moved more than 100 petabytes of scientific data into the cloud, 350 national research programs, 50 million compute hours, and trained more than 3,000 individuals.
That's really interesting. I think sometimes organizations can focus on the pure technology and neglect the importance of the non-technology side of things. So Don, I'm curious as to whether or not that was something that you saw when you shifted Goldman Sachs from private to public cloud.
No, I think that hit it spot on. I think the cloud is not just another data center. It's not a path towards replacing one set of tools with another. It's fundamentally, and where we've seen success, including at Goldman, it was anchored in the view that we have a different need, a challenge often to our existing business that we need to respond to and we need to react, that the cloud becomes the critical fabric in which to enable that to occur. And in our case at Goldman, our first usage of public cloud was driven by a lot of the changes and regulations that came out of the financial crisis and some of the stress tests introduced by the Federal Reserve, which required the amount of computing that the firm needed to do to run Monte Carlo simulations on its business risk just went up by a factor. And the ability to support that need and actually get the information that was needed to help manage risk in the markets during such turbulent times was just not going to be possible by traditional building out either new facilities, which could take years to do, or even looking at building out in existing co-location facilities. So our first use of cloud was driven by that challenge of how do we really respond to a fundamental change in our business that requires massive increases in computing that can be delivered in a very short period of time.
I think the point about not doing technology for technology's sake, but rather focusing on the real business or the customer need is really important. So Jerry, in your role as CTO at Starbucks, you must have seen a lot of cloud-based digital solutions. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the magic of what makes all of these solutions really work?
Yeah. Well, I love that question because it's a really simple answer. It's all about the people. And a whole lot of a journey, whether it's a technology journey to cloud or in the old days, to web or client server, it's really about how do you get your talented technologist skills that can help them make that next transition to the new platforms. And so I would say that 5 years ago when we started this journey, we had nothing in the cloud. And today, everything we do that's new goes into the cloud, and most of our core systems have since been migrated to the cloud. And so one of the things that was so important in that journey was making sure our teams had a chance to learn those new skills. And so here's a few things that for me were really important. First is giving people a chance to fail and making sure that there were some safe places that they could literally learn by playing. The other was, as we have continued to hire and add to our teams, the most important skill we're looking for is a love of learning and being lifelong learners. And so as you're thinking about your teams, don't think about you have to sort of clear everybody out and start fresh. What you really need to do is think about how to ignite that learning. And I have a great story that I love to share. Early in our transformation, I had a senior leader who had a very big multi-year project. And one day, this leader brought in her team and said, hey, I need to buy some servers. And here's the amount it's going to cost. And here's it's going to take, 6 months to get this spun up. And then we're going to move all this data there. And I just stopped and I said, no, we're not buying any servers for this. I want you to use this opportunity to learn about the cloud. And we had a very animated conversation. And she wasn't very happy with me because, it was like this was a high profile project and how could we take a risk on something we don't know? And none of her team knew how to do it. And so what we did was we partnered her with someone who had done this type of work before. And we said, hey, for the next 6 weeks, you're go and work with this team and see how fast you can spin up what they need. 4 days later, they came back and they had already spun up all of the resources they needed for this project. And from that day on, I will tell you that this senior leader became a poster child for what you could do with the cloud. And so part of it is let people have an opportunity to own that success. And once they own that success, they're just going to help grow.
That is an awesome example. I truly believe that the capacity for learning is the real differentiator in the war for talent these days. So I want to turn to Don and Andrea perhaps for some quick thoughts on this. Don, how have you seen organizations help their teams to learn?
It's a fantastic point, and it's easy sometimes to lose sight that technology is about people and technologists, and the ability to enable your business through innovative technology requires investment in people. So I think very, very similar to the story that we just heard. We took a bit of a approach in terms of enabling parts of our cloud environment that was designed by default, to support people's learning. So giving people access to learn about the various services in the cloud, focusing less about, is this going to cost us too much money, but taking, certainly a long-term view that in order to really facilitate for our people that they needed to have access to these new sets of capabilities in order to begin to experiment, to build their own acumen around it. So that was an important starting point. But one of our challenges, certainly in the banking industry, and I assume other financial services will see this, is that because of the nature of regulations, that unless you really do design for these safe havens and create those safe spots where people can go and learn, it's just very difficult because everything is going to be closed and everything's going to be a risk until you can prove that it's not. So, very, very similar. Our perspective was, in order to really enable the firm to embrace the cloud and to drive innovation, we have to make sure we're recognizing that individuals need to learn these types of skills, and that the best way to learn is always by doing. So give them the basis to do that, give them the capability to do it, and then see what they come out and do. And many, many great stories that came from that process.
And Andrea, how do you guys approach this at the NIH?
So at NIH, learning is built into our DNA. Our mission statement is to seek fundamental knowledge about how living systems operate and to apply that knowledge to improve health and reduce disease.
So speaking to all of you makes me think that cloud transformations must be a piece of cake. But I know that these programs are incredibly complex, and I'm sure that many of our tech leaders in the audience today would agree with me. You need to worry about cost blowouts. You need to worry about security. You're constantly making trade-offs. So with the superpower of hindsight, perhaps, what were some of the pitfalls that you wish you could have avoided? And Don, I'd love to go to you first on this one.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we have absolutely seen is, and we learned this in our own experience at Goldman, was so much of your attention goes into the front end of your delivery. It goes into your applications, your application teams, it goes into perhaps how you're looking to modernize your software delivery pipelines and your DevOps and SDLC. But, cloud is foundationally going to impact everybody in your organization. And whether it be people in risk and control positions, security teams, et cetera, that I think, one of the things that we learned the hard way was that, number one, the cloud is a team sport. Number two, that once you start moving at cloud speed in any part of your organization, everybody else is going to be impacted by that. So you have to really be thinking about how do you really drive that same sets of principles, of the same focus on driving towards more agile practices, driving towards more data-driven and technologically automated solutions everywhere. And so what we learned at Goldman was pretty quickly that we could have a really awesome capability to build things in the cloud, but we couldn't get them past our security control processes. And even if we did, then the second you wanted to change it, you had to go back and do that process all over again. So we learned that we needed to invest in really making end-to-end solutions. So our security control functions became more agile. They became more, DevSecOps, in nature than they had been. And those changes take time, and they take time, and they take investment. And so, I look at it end to end. Had we started those investments right as we started, the application investments, we would have been much better off and probably have reduced a lot of friction and time. But ultimately, we got where we needed to get to. But that's one thing, and I see that pattern in many companies where, again, the natural focus is going to be on the business problem you're trying to solve. As we mentioned at the beginning of this, that's such a critical component in cloud success. But you really need to look holistically and think about the implications across all parts, from audit, risk and control, and security, as well as your application and your DevOps teams.
So the end-to-end strategic component seems mission critical. So moving to you, Jerry, what did you find personally hard as you moved Starbucks to the cloud?
Well, I have to say, I do think that moving to cloud is much like moving to any new technology. And the most important thing most CIOs or CTOs learn early on is you've got to have an architectural perspective. And we just heard some of that from Don as well. So I think one of the ways to decomplex the problem is to make sure that you have some foundational architectural guardrails before everybody sort of goes crazy. And then as people are learning, you need to figure out which pieces can be reused by teams so people don't reinvent the wheel. So for example, a CI/CD pipeline, getting that nailed within one of your DevOps teams is really important, and figuring out then how to replicate that across the board. I also think the tension with security is real, and it's big and it's important. And we've seen lots of high visibility issues out there in the news when companies didn't attend to security well in the cloud. Just because it's in the cloud doesn't make it secure. In fact, one would argue it may be harder to secure it well in the cloud. So ensuring your architectural point of view and guardrails include very strong security norms, and making sure you not only put those in place, but you monitor them is important. So I think some of this is the same stuff we've done forever, but it continues to be very important in the cloud. The cloud is not a wide open playground. And if you're running a large enterprise, you shouldn't treat it that way. It is an agile, flexible, scalable, resilient environment, and you still need to do good architectural planning for that.
Andrea, what about you? What are some of the things that keep you up at night?
I couldn't agree more. With the cloud, the rigor and discipline of software engineering and operations and management principles are as important as ever. Planning, architecture, engineering, all of those things matter a great deal. Some of the challenges or downside risks that we struggle with is our goal is to make our data fit what we call fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Again, we have a very data-centric approach, lesser on our business applications. And so our goal is to put the data out there, bring the researchers to it, let them bring their tools and analytics. That's often some of the science that's being conducted, is that analytic work that they're bringing to the table, and then leave their results behind for the next researcher, and to do that in collaboration with others in as transparent and easy way as possible.
So on the topic of data security, Don, I'm going to have to ask you, you are no stranger to highly regulated data environments. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think absolutely, as expressed by really kind of both of the other panelists. Security has to be, and protection of information has to be the top of mind topic for anything that you're doing in the public cloud. Most institutions and most organizations, if you look backwards, from an on-premise perspective, ran with a physical firewall that protected their own either privately owned or privately negotiated, data centers and hardware. And where they didn't, where they were facing off to the public internet, they had DMZs and things were chaotic in the DMZ, but it was a very small percentage of your overall, footprint of your applications and data. And so you had, a design model that protected things. You could argue whether it was better or not, but it ultimately, reduced the exposures in the public cloud. Everything is possible to be exposed, and everything is running in an environment where you just don't know, who's next to you on the same host, perhaps. So I think, the whole aspect of really thinking about what is the types of security models that are necessary for your business, moving them into what becomes both a continuous control model so that you have declarative controls and what your assets are, and you can validate that things are in control on a continuous basis is essential. One of the things, again, coming back to people, since we always kind of square back to people and technology, is it's just very difficult, to assume that people can really have the deep experience. It's hard to have a PhD in, computer science and a PhD in network and security and control design and whatnot. And so you have to build those guardrails that make sure that you have the right architecture and the right investments to know what your risk and control posture is and to know that it's being implemented to the extent that you can. And it's not easy, but it's an absolute necessary step. I'd say one of the things that makes me the most excited about the future is the fact that there has been so much advancement in this space. I wouldn't pretend that things are perfect, but whether it be the providers themselves or the whole ecosystem of other companies that are coming together to make that infrastructure and the capabilities to build and implement really strong security, defense in depth design models around data is getting a lot of great minds working on it. And I think that's fantastic because it will help really enable, I think, further growth of the cloud for enterprises as it becomes easier to just get these types of services versus having to go through as many of the pioneers did of building it themselves and constructing it from the bottom up.
Of course. So besides data and security, perhaps, Jerry, are there other downsides that our audience should be wary of?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I would agree with both Dawn and Andrea. I think security is top of mind for all of us. But there is one more that hasn't been mentioned, which has to do with cost. And I always love talking to people early in the journey of cloud because it usually goes something like this. It's going to be cheaper. And really, in many cases, we're not seeing that. What we are seeing is you're going to get more capability for the money. But the risk is everybody starts consuming it like crazy and the cost goes up and up and up and up. And this is especially true when you're dealing with data and you're dealing with data where you're trying to unlock a lot of different business capabilities quickly and you're extending that out into the user community. So cost is interesting. And so really staying attentive to the value proposition of the spend. Many successful companies are just spending more and more and more on cloud, and that may be right, and that may be very valuable to your business, and that return on that investment may pay off. But there could be other businesses where you get kind of caught up in the glamour of all you can do, and just because you can build an ML model for something may not mean that that ML model has any value to your business. So my warning or my headline for people to stay attuned to is make sure that as you're spending money on cloud, first of all, don't kid yourself, it's going to be expensive. Make sure that you're tying that expense back against a value proposition that you can measure and prove so you don't end up having to re-justify it over and over.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. In fact, around 80% of enterprises consider managing cloud spend a real challenge. I'd imagine it's very top of mind for many of our audience today. And I'd even say that cloud is top of mind for many 2021 boards. So how do you think the nature of the conversation on cloud has changed in the last year? Jerry, I'd love to hear from you first.
Sure. Well, bringing the board along in any transformation is vital. And so the first thing I would say is start talking to your board very early in your decision to start moving to cloud. Tell them why. We started this conversation talking about things like, is it because of scale? Is it because of resiliency? Is it because of speed? Be very clear about that. Then give the board markers along the way where they can celebrate small successes so that everybody feels that you're building up and getting better. Now, here we come with a pandemic. Oh my gosh, overnight, digital becomes one of the most important channels, if not the most important channel for almost any consumer-facing business in the world, not just in the US, everywhere. It changed everything. And those businesses that had started down a path of using cloud as a valuable asset for scale, for resiliency, for connectivity to mobile or digital solutions, were advantaged. And so making sure your board understands what you're doing, why you're doing it, celebrating the success along the way. And when you see a big disruptor like the pandemic, use that to double down. And so I think that becomes a pretty easy conversation. Again, you're just tying it right back to business value.
Makes sense. Andrea, are you seeing a similar phenomenon with your key stakeholders?
Yes, well, again, with COVID, we've learned we have biology and biomedical research is usually a long game, right? But what we've watched with the advances in technology, the ability we have to get to data in ways we've never been able to, and then with the pandemic, we've learned we have to conduct research at the speed of infection. We have to be able to do unprecedented things in unprecedented ways at unprecedented speeds. And so that has helped change the discussion and change the dynamics of how we approach things. You know, today in today's lab, everything is a computer. A microscope is a computer. The scientific instrumentations are computers. And they're all generating vast amounts of data. So anything we can do to look at how we can accelerate and transform the way we're conducting research, the way we share those results, and the way we get those discoveries into patient care faster and with more quality, it is what resonates in these discussions. And cloud has an important role to play in that journey.
And Don, what are some of the questions that maybe your boardroom is asking you that perhaps they weren't asking you 2 years ago?
Yeah, I think if you thought about a lot of the things the boards would ask several years back, it was more about, are we falling behind in general in innovation and digitization, and of course, cloud would get wrapped up in that conversation. But there was more of a market peering, which institutions are leading, where do we fit? Are we middle of the pack, back of the pack? And I think there was a lot of board focus on obviously wanting to ensure that their businesses were adapting and evolving for the 21st century, but it would be more in that context. And I think, as we've heard the stories just from our other two panelists, COVID kind of changed everything. With COVID, it became resilience, it became survival, it became how do we make sure in the kind of fog of war that we're able to just run our business in a way that's safe. It was very difficult to get, people, electricians sent to the data centers to add to capacity while the stock markets or volatility is growing, yet you need more computers. And so I think, what's coming out of the IC from the kind of post-COVID world is both this recognition that there's a new resiliency challenge for boards, that they really need to think and understand better about the entirety of the business resiliency from a human capital perspective up into operational and even physical risks. And I think that the cloud becomes even more important in that, because it's going to be unlikely, there may be some, but most institutions are going to look at resiliency and really lean on publicly available infrastructure in ways perhaps that they may not have in the past.
Right. So it certainly feels like whilst we've made so much progress, really we're still at base camp in the journey on cloud. So as we draw towards the end of this session, I wanted just to circle back to the theme of the panel today, challenging tech's path forward. And I'm going to ask you to paint a picture on what you think this cloud scene is going to look like in the next few years. Andrea, perhaps you could offer some thoughts first.
I don't know exactly what the picture is going to look like, but I believe this, you couldn't be a technologist and be in a more exciting time than where we are today. Not only is technology integral to everything we do, how we live and work and conduct, our business, but it is truly, it has proven how we can survive during a pandemic, how we can adapt to changing circumstances that we never foresaw, and how it is helping us to deliver, testing and therapeutics and vaccines to pull us out of it. And the kinds of advances that we've seen in the last decade, I think will be almost nothing compared to what we'll see in the next decade. And I think it's not just technology, it's the incredibly innovative, talented workforce that we have, that with the creativity that never ceases to amaze me, and how we tackle tough problems. We've seen unprecedented ones over the last year or so, and I'm sure we'll see more. But I think technology is such an incredible tool that we have in our toolkit to helping us be postured to work through any one of these. It's just going to be a very exciting. It's an exciting field and an exciting time to be in it.
Fantastic. Don, any advice that you'd perhaps share to the CIOs, CTOs, tech leaders in our audience today?
One of the things that we focused a lot on that drove our strategy at Goldman was just the change in demographics of the amount of people who were in the workforce, entering the workforce, and our clients in their workforce that were tech savvy, that didn't want a report, they wanted data, they wanted the tool that allowed them to do things on their own because they want to be part of that creative cycle. And I think from an advice perspective, listen, I think a couple things. One, I really believe it's important for people in CIO and other types of leadership seats to recognize that these are big changes and they're big problems, and therefore there's probably nothing more important than the leaders taking on that as a big part of their responsibility to help become part of that. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to know everything or know exactly what to do, but I think providing that form of leadership is essential. And I can tell you from my experience in a very large investment bank that the easier thing to do sometimes as a CIO is to help drive tech strategy. The much harder thing, but the more important thing, is to really help drive change across all different parts of the organization that may not be comfortable with that change yet. And so I think that there's a huge opportunity for CIOs to really get in front of this and become change agents in their business and help lead perhaps in ways that they may not have or may not have had the opportunity as much from a playing field perspective. And I would also just say community. I do think that it's been outstanding to look back over the last 10 years, and not that cloud was the entire catalyst for this, but that confluence of really kind of driving open source and open communities of industry coming together to solve and help shape problems, shape best practices. It just creates tremendous value. And so I think, whatever industry you're in, I'm sure that there will be, various communities that you can become part of, you can help participate in. And I think it's important not just for, helping kind of learn with others, but I think it's super important to your own people to have the opportunities to interact and work on projects and problems that may feel bigger than just your own company.
And last, but certainly not least, Jerry, any parting thoughts on this one?
Well, I would start by just amplifying what both Andrea said about this is the best time to be a technologist, and what Don said about you have to be a change agent. And those two things, I have to say for the last 28, 30 something years has been true all along. And so I would remind us that the best CIOs do a few things really well and just keep reinventing how they do it. The first is making sure that you're super tight with business and have tight business partnerships, and that everything you're doing is tied to business value. The second is making sure that you're reaching out to those technology suppliers who are a wealth of information and knowledge. I mean, they're not just the people you buy services from, they're also the people who are leading the next generation of engineering and software transformation. So use those folks, get close to them, figure out how they can be your secret weapon in innovation. And then third, but certainly not third really, is making sure you have the right talent and you nurture it and you keep growing it and you give people room to explore and make that part as important as hiring the right people, keeping people and keeping them fed. And then you'll kind of know when it's all successful when suddenly you have an organization that is feeling valued by the business. And whether the business is consumers or the business is actually P&L owners, whatever, if you have partnered successfully with the business, got the right talent on board and keep them growing, leverage that powerful technology supply chain you have, I think amazing things will happen. And at the end of the day, having great technology that really amplifies human connection, the best technology is the technology that you don't even notice you have, the technology that's become so ingrained and easy to use that it's joyful. And that's what we're all after in technology.
Joyful technology. What a brilliant way to end this session. And with that, I can only say a huge thank you to Andrea, Don, and Jerry for joining us today and for sharing your cloud experiences. After an exhausting year for all, I'm personally very energized to see what the next few years of cloud technology will hold. I hope each of you watching in the audience feel the same way. Thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, Kate.
Stay safe.